Well, good morning. This is another one of my series of interviews with experts throughout the country and the world talking about special issues in college counseling. This is for the Special Issues in Education class. And with me today, I have Jennie Kent. She is with she has her own practice in Bogota, Colombia. Welcome, Jennie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Jennie, can you give my class a little bit of information about yourself, your background, your experience, and why you do what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I have lived abroad for 23 years. I basically graduated from college and moved to South America. I've lived in 4 different countries around the world, and I've been in educational consulting for about 5 years. And the real reason why I became an educational consultant is because way back in the 1980s, when I was going to boarding school, I used an educational consultant. And I truly believe that he changed my life. I think I would be in a very different place if it hadn't been for his guidance and expertise helping me kind of choose a boarding school that was going to be the right fit for me. And when I moved to South America, I saw that there was a real need for consultants in the market. There were a lot of international students that were very interested in studying abroad, but just didn't know where to start.
And so how did you, so you had that experience with a consultant yourself, so you knew that was something that was available. How did you yourself get started in doing this?
Well, I actually had been doing some admission work with my boarding school for quite some time. I was one of those kids, both when I was in boarding school and in college. I worked at the admissions department. I gave tours. And after I graduated, I was helping my boarding school with international applicants, and then they reached out to me to see if I would help them to kind of open up the market down here a little bit. I went to a very international boarding school, Northville Mount Herman, and they hadn't had Colombian students in a while. So I actually worked some boarding school fairs and spoke with them and said, I really want to get into this. I already had a master's in education at the time. I had already been working as a teacher. And they recommended that I get in touch with the IECA and go to a summer training program that they have to kind of get my feet wet and see if that was really what I wanted. And I loved it. I haven't looked back.
Absolutely. So what's the draw for your students to the United States? Why would a Colombian student or a South American student want to come study in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, one of the obvious draws for international students going to the US or even the UK is prestige. They're very interested in going to a university that has a worldwide reputation. So that's one of the things. But the big draw in terms of the US for my students is the actual academic program. In South America, many of the university programs are like the ones in Europe, where you need to be very focused and know exactly what you want to do before you start. And if you, let's say, enroll in as a history major and then decide that you want to study law, you have to start over. So the big draw for the U.S. is that students can start a program, explore lots of interests, and then have a year or two to choose.
And that makes a big, big difference for them. It gives them that opportunity to explore and see what other options there are. Now, what about the UK? What draws them to the UK?
The UK, again, definitely prestige is part of it. Right now, another big piece is that the UK is still considerably less expensive than the United States. And because most of my students will be coming out of either schools where they'll have a country-specific baccalaureate, like the German Abitur, the French baccalaureate, the Swiss Matura, or an international baccalaureate, they can start in the UK and they're 3-year programs generally. So that's 1 year less, and it's more economical. So that's kind of the really big draw right now for the UK. And for other countries, again, you can go to a very prestigious university for a very small amount of money. You can study in the Netherlands for 8,000 euros a year tuition. I mean, the cost difference it's phenomenal. Yeah.
Wow. So how is the admissions process different for your international students? What do you have to help them walk through in terms of the whole admissions, as a counselor?
Yeah, I feel like I don't feel like there are a lot of things that are hugely different for international students, but for me, probably the biggest piece initially, there are sort of two big pieces. One of them is just making sure that they understand the educational system. So for instance, for my students that want to go to the United States, they don't know very often the difference between a liberal arts college, a university, a school, an academy. So I spend a lot of time kind of making sure that they understand that. And there's a misconception that if it's a college, it's not as good as a university. So they will sometimes automatically rule out anything that doesn't say university in the name. So I need to start with that. And then a really big piece and something that I'm very passionate about is financial assistance. Because it is so expensive to study abroad, but generally in the United States. And the waters were kind of murky for international students that wanted to study abroad and needed financial assistance. And I work with a lot of dual nationals. And, one of the first things you need to do is define who is an international student for each university, because they all define it differently. And so in some, you might be eligible for aid. In some, you might not be. In some, you might be read as an international student. In some, you might not be. So you kind of need to figure out for each school exactly, how the student is going to be viewed and looked at. And then, there's testing. There are lots of schools that are test optional for everyone. And then there are a lot of other schools that are test optional for international students. So that's another big piece, because I very often get students very late in the process. These are students that study at European schools. They're used to applying in March, June, sometimes after they've gotten their test score results. So they come to me very, very late, and a lot of times have no testing. This is quite common for me to have a student call me in December. They don't have a TOEFL, they don't have an IELTS, they don't have an SAT, they don't have an ACT. And so, you kind of have to scramble quite a bit right at the beginning just to see exactly what they need and get them on track. And many universities will not require an international student to have an SAT or an ACT or a subject test, but they're almost always going to require a TOEFL or an IELTS if they haven't been in an English-based system. And I actually, for myself, ask my students to take a TOEFL or an IELTS, even if they've been in an English-based system, because I find that helps me enormously in terms of figuring out which schools are going to be a good fit for them academically. And then again, translating documents. If a student is coming out of a German school or a French school, for instance, here in South America, there will not be any English anywhere on any of their transcripts. So those students will need to have transcripts, translated. And then it's sort of who's going to translate it. And an additional factor down here is so few students are leaving some of these schools to study abroad that there isn't really anyone at their high school that's a guidance counselor that can help them. That's why families find me. Normally when families come to me, if there's a guidance counselor at their school, I say, well, you're already paying for a guidance counselor at your school. You should use the guidance counselor. But I have some really tiny schools where the students don't have help. And the issue, they're going to get help from me. But then the question is, who's going to be their referee in the case of the UK? Who's going to be that school liaison for, let's say, the Common App in the US? And so then we've got to identify, if there isn't anyone already identified at their school, who's going to be the best person to coordinate all of that paperwork within your school and write a letter of recommendation for you in English. So
Mm-hmm.
those are kind of some of the larger factors that that you're kind of hit with immediately.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know, and you touched on the difference in the timelines, and I know I had students who've done the UK and the UCAS, and that timeline is very different from the American. I mean, the American is so much earlier than the UK, and so it changes your whole timeline as a counselor in terms of what you do and how you manage all of that. So,
That's true.
yeah, you mentioned.
And one of the things that I find is when I speak to other counselors and consultants and I hear about like their lulls in the year, like their quiet periods in the year and when they take holiday, totally different from mine. It's totally different.
Do you ever get a holiday, Jenny?
I do. I usually get a holiday in July.
There you go. So you mentioned something about dual citizen, students who have dual citizen, and you probably have TCK students. We've talked with Becky Grappo about TCK and what that means and how some are international, some are not. So how does that, when they have that dual citizenship or a TCK, how does that affect their process and especially their transition? And maybe you can talk about transition just a little bit too.
Yeah, I think, for the TCKs, the transition is sort of the big part. They, generally speaking, my TCKs, they're going to do better off at a school where students are a little bit more cosmopolitan, just because they have generally lived a much more cosmopolitan life, and so they feel more comfortable. And the most important thing for a TCK, as with anyone, but in particular for a TCK, is kind of finding their group. I mean, it's really critical to feel like you belong, because TCKs have grown up not necessarily feeling like they belong and experiencing tremendous losses, tremendous gains as well. But the transition can be particularly tough. So one of the things that I look at with TCKs is, are there schools that have stronger programs for TCKs? Everyone knows Lewis and Clark. They have probably one of the stronger programs. And then just in general, are there strong international student services? And I've seen everything. Obviously they point this out because I'm located in South America. But, for instance, at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, in the International Student Lounge, they have sun lamps for the South Americans, because they say it's so hard for them in the winter. It's so gray. It's so cold. They're missing home. They're missing their families. And sometimes they just need a little extra light. And things like that seem almost silly, but they make a huge difference. And schools that have TCK programs, the students are going to be able to transition a lot better, because there's already a lot of understanding about where they're coming from and what their experience is. So I think, again, that finding your group, finding your niche at that school it's going to make all the difference.
So how do counselors find to visit? Through visiting to make sure that, to see what the different programs offered? How do they find out which ones have the stronger TCK or international support for the student?
Yeah, I spend a ton of time and resources visiting. I think that's really, really critical. And I feel like that's where I make a big difference for my families. I'm sort of the first set of eyes. And it's something that, like anything else, you get better at. You kind of get a feel for campuses and can say, like, all right, well, they're doing a better job with this. But it's all about researching. I've watched pretty much any webinar that is offered, I sign up for. The Girl Scouts have had some great webinars about being a TCK. Obviously,
really?
Yeah, they have. Lots of, they had a webinar with Tina Quick once, and, I watched that. Obviously, all of the different professional associations, NACAC has great webinars. IACAC, formerly OACAC. It just changed. So in case your students don't know that it just flipped, the International ACAC has webinars, HECA offers webinars, IECA offers webinars. And I kind of always feel like I'm going to learn something. I might not know what, but I'm going to learn something. And I also think if you're in a professional association, you know, the listservs, the talk lists are a great resource because you can reach out and start learning from others and say, you know, hey, I noticed that Lewis and Clark has this TCK program. Has anyone sent a TCK there? What has the experience been? And I believe in collaborating. You know, the more we all collaborate, I think the better off we are for it. So, you know, but that's just me. So I do think that, you know, you need to research and then reach out to anybody that you can that might have knowledge of programs and, you know, say like, these are my impressions that I came away with, you know, do you think that this is accurate in your opinion?
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you about the collaboration. I feel like that's part of our role as counselors and advisors, and the collaborative just helps all of us to be better. So you mentioned how the financial is an important part, and I know you worked with Jeff Levy and put together a resource, and I've posted it for my class, but you want to talk about that a little bit and what, you know, because I know a ton of research went into that and kind of what's behind that and what you hope that delivers for counselors.
Yeah, you know, this is just, Jeff and I collaborate on with our students sometimes, and we were talking one day, and you know, his real strength is financial aid, and my real strength we're international students, and we kind of said like, you know, there was a resource that was available at the time, a fabulous resource by Doug Thompson. But there were just a few data points that I felt like would be useful for me as a consultant. And I also, Doug had this great list of like schools that are really excellent giving financial aid to international students. But I felt like I also needed to know which ones weren't, you know, to not waste my time any farther. And so Jeff and I got together, and yeah, we did a ton of research. I'm very into Excel and data, and I get a little obsessive. And basically, so the way we formed the list is I said, okay, as an international consultant, what are the schools that families ask about over and over again? And for me, for my students, they want an urban school. You know, Colombians in particular, they like Boston, they like DC. You know, California is kind of getting on their radar now. Some of them like New York, but there were kind of schools that I was being asked about over and over again. And I thought, you know, regardless of how any of us feel about rankings, you know, U.S. News and World Report is something that international families look at all the time. And, you know, for my international students, what they say is, look, I'm not saying that I can't get a good education at another school, but my point is, you know, everybody here has heard of NYU. You know, so for them, it's also, I don't want to come back with a degree, you know, from some obscure college, because people will look at my transcript and say, well, what's that? And so what Jeff and I did is we put together a list of the top 100 universities, the top 100 liberal arts colleges, top 100 for business, top 100 for engineering, because generally speaking, my students are going to look at law, which they will study at home, medicine, which they will study at home, business, engineering. I have a lot of students interested in economics and communications, but you know, I thought, well, these are lists that I know these international families are consulting. These are schools that if I put on the list, they'll all nod their head and say, oh yes, I've heard of that. And then we also looked at like CTCL schools, which I think are, you know, colleges that change lives. That's really another brand. And, you know, a lot of times in order to get your students to open their minds, you need to have a brand that you can link a school into. And then we just kind of started researching, and we went to the common data sets because I think that's information that the colleges are providing. It may be correct or incorrect, but I can't do any better than that. And, I can't be betting, the information that the colleges are giving us. And what we were looking at basically were, how many international students were at the schools, what percentage of them were getting aid, what were the average awards, and for me, which awards were need-based or merit-based aid, because international students are very attractive to universities for lots of different reasons, but one of them is because generally they're paying full freight. And so I need to know from my students that perhaps their families have the resources but do not want to spend that amount every year educating their student abroad. If it's just a need-based aid school, you don't have any need and you don't want to pay $60,000 a year, let's take it off your list.
Right.
So that's kind of why we made that chart the way we did. It's really about saving time and being efficient. And then after it came out, a whole bunch of institutions got in touch with me and said, hey, Jenny, I'm not on your list. So I said, well, just send me the common data set. I'm happy to add you to the list. So that's how the list grew. And then the last time we updated it, I added a lot of art schools because we do have students that are interested, at least here in Columbia, in studying arts abroad and film and things that the US is just very, very strong at, and where the programs have a little bit more history. And then we got in touch with the College Board, and they actually have just released their own list, which I'm really happy about. It's excellent. Yoko Kono put it out. We had talked to her about maybe combining our lists at one point. But what's so great about the College Board is they have a lot more weight than Jennie Kent and Jeff Levy. And so there are several schools that I requested information from 3-4 times, schools that outright refuse to give us the information, but they're giving it to the College Board. So
Right.
some of these schools that didn't want to share information with me because maybe they don't know who I am and, they didn't think it was important to give it to me, since the College Board asked, they've given it to the College Board. So I like that College Board list as well, because it's the same data from the same year, but sometimes if you can't find a school on our list, you're going to find it on that College Board list. And that's 800 and some schools. It's every school that offers aid for international students.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll look that up and put that on our class too.
Yeah, it's
so,
brand
Jenny,
2 weeks old.
What? Say that again.
I said it's brand new. I think it's only been out for a couple of weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, good. That makes me feel better because I hadn't heard about it. So I'll look it up.
Yeah.
So if people want to get a hold of you, how do they get a hold of you?
Oh, you can send me an email. My email is jk@educateabroad.co, not .com, .co like the country Colombia. And yeah, feel free to send me emails. I'm pretty good at answering quickly. I always get back to everybody. I'm as obsessive about my inbox as I am about Excel sheets.
Well, Jenny, thank you very much. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime at one of the upcoming conferences. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good luck, everybody.